Let's take you now to the person who's been at the center of the storm. The Planning Commission's recent report that said that poverty figures under the UPA have actually come down to now a little under 22% has sparked a massive and fierce political debate. The BJP has gone so far as to say that the data is fudged. And then, of course, there continue to be questions raised as to how anybody who earns 33 rupees per day in the cities can be considered not poor. I put all of these and all of your questions to Montek Ahluwalia, joining us today as our newsmaker. In the past week, we have seen a number of UPA politicians who've literally had to eat their words. This after outrageous comments on how much money it takes to get 1 square meal a day. It was suggested by some that 12 rupees is enough, then by others that 5 rupees is enough, and then there were some who said even 1 rupee can get you enough food to give you, well, 1 good meal a day. Like we said, these politicians have had to eat their words, but it's reopened a ferocious public debate on exactly how the poverty line should be defined and by whom. This, of course, after the UPA and the Planning Commission said that poverty figures have significantly gone down. Joining us now is the Planning Commission Chief, Montek Singh Ahluwalia. On the one hand, your commission had a report that should have been the harbinger of good news, of good political messaging, to make the argument that poverty has actually come down. But when you see its articulation in these kind of absurd idioms, as I've just mentioned, 12 rupees is enough to get a meal, 5 rupees is enough, 1 rupee is enough, what everybody is saying is that this is just mocking the poor. Are you embarrassed by the kind of comments you've heard from some of the UPA politicians?
Well, actually, I've not heard those comments. I've seen some news reports. Let's focus on what the Planning Commission said and did. Individuals can make whatever comments they like, and I can't comment on that.
But the fact is that the Planning Commission, and you know this well, ever since it has made the argument that the poverty line as used by you, even to make the argument that poverty figures have come down, essentially says that 33 rupees a day in the cities and 27 rupees in the rural areas is enough for a person to be below or above the poverty line. It's the cutoff you use. This has been used again and again, Montek, to make the point that you are disconnected from reality.
Well, look, let me say, first of all, this is not the Planning Commission's line. I mean, the poverty line is not drawn by the Planning Commission. It's actually drawn by expert groups. And the line you're talking about is the line that was recommended by Suresh Tendulkar's expert committee. Now, remember, the UPA came in 2004. At that time, the poverty line that was being used was very low. And there was a feeling that, look, it's just too low. So it was the UPA that set up the Tendulkar committee in order to review the position, and the Tendulkar committee said we should have a higher poverty line. So the first thing to say about the Tendulkar committee is that it didn't raise the poverty line. I mean, the previous government had made no effort whatsoever to raise the poverty line. So we ought to recognize that in UPA 1, this decision was taken. Now, Tendulkar adjusted the line upward. That made the percentage below the line higher than it otherwise would be. But you know, even that was not felt by many people to be appropriate, and there's a reason for that. They thought that, you know, food, subsidized food was being linked to below poverty line numbers, and they felt that the number of people who should get subsidized food is much larger. Now, actually, one group feels that the subsidized food as an entitlement should be universal. Everybody, you, me, everyone should get subsidized food. What the government did was to de-link poverty calculations from the subsidized food issue.
But isn't that paradoxical? Because one assumes that if today, as per your report, when you say that 21%, roughly 21% or 22% of the population is now poor, but you are reaching, you want your food security bill to go up to 800 plus million people.
But let's be clear.
Now, it assumes therefore that apart from these 21 to 22%, everybody else is not poor, therefore can afford food.
No, it doesn't follow. Look, let me say, you know, entitlement to free goods of various kinds is not actually limited only to the poor. I mean, for example, free education is available to everybody. as far as universal health care is concerned, if you want to opt for the public sector, that should also be available free to everybody. There are many things that are available to everybody, some things that are only given to the poor. And on the food issue, the perception was that you need some support not just for the poor, but also for the Aam Aadmi. I mean, you know, the concept of poor, first of all, the line is always arbitrary. There's a lot of argument that even the Tendulkar line is too low. And the government has recognized that maybe we should take a second look at it.
So you're reviewing it under Rangarajan?
UPA 2 under Rangarajan is reviewing it. But the existing Tendulkar line was there, and we knew what was happening to poverty. And remember, in the period from 1993 to 2004, okay, using the Tendulkar line but going backward, you found that the decline in poverty was about 0.74 percentage points per year, okay, over that period. If you went forward from 2004, we had data up to 2009, and the 2009 data showed that actually the rate of improvement in poverty had increased compared to the pre-2004 numbers. Now the latest data that came out was for 2011-12. That's the last year of the 5-year plan, yes. 11th 5-year plan. Yes. It would have been absurd for us not to show what does the Tendulkar line show as far as poverty is concerned. That would be dishonest, because the debate had existed earlier. So what does it show? What it shows is a very simple thing. Prior to 2004, the decline in poverty every year was 0.74 percentage points. After 2004, it's 2.2 percentage points. So the decline in poverty using the Tendulkar line is 3 times higher. Now, by the way, I'm quite happy for someone to say, let's raise the line. But this conclusion would not alter. The point we are trying to make is, wherever you put the poverty line, it can be 50% above Tendulkar. This conclusion that during the UPA period, we did a much better job on poverty than in the previous period. This is the main point that's coming out. That's why politically it's being attacked. It's not being attacked, in my view, because of debates on the level of poverty. People don't want to recognize that the UPA has done 3 times better than the pre-UPA period in the matter of reducing poverty.
That's very important. Why is it then that so many of the UPA leaders themselves, Digvijay Singh, Kapil Sibal, they're uncomfortable with the Planning Commission's method of evaluating poverty? I've got your point that where you draw the Tendulkar line, you believe that the UPA has performed better when it comes to decreasing a decrease in poverty. My question is simply this: is the political messaging going all haywire? And is it going haywire because you have rising inflation, you have reduced growth? If you go out today and you ask people what 33 rupees gets them, they will all tell you that it gets them very little. You have families today who say that they can't afford to give their children milk more than 3 times a day because milk is 22 rupees a litre. So my question to you, Montek Ahluwalia, is this: what would you say to the Kapil Sibals and the Digvijay Singh who have a problem with the way your Planning Commission is evaluating and assessing the poverty levels in the country?
Look, analytically, what Kapil has said is that, you know, the present method is a bit abstract, we should improve it. Even we agree. Look, in the 12th 5-year plan, we have made it quite clear that the concept of poverty is multidimensional. The traditional method of measuring poverty, that's the only thing that gets out of surveys, is consumption based. Now, I agree with the view that, for example, if you are not getting access to clean drinking water, but you've got even 150 rupees a day, you're deprived. I mean, what is poor or what is deprived is a different issue. So I have no difficulty with saying you need a much more complex, multi-dimensional measure to get to poverty. But you know, for that you need to build a database that will actually tell you what the situation is. For example, we have data on how many people have access to a protected source of drinking water. But we don't have enough data on whether those sources have been tested for chemical purity or bacteriological purity. There's no point in inventing inventing concepts that are not yet measured. This is a concept that's measured. It's not complete. But the central point that's coming out, why is everyone trying to make it more complicated? I'm the first person to say we ought to have a better measure. But whatever measure you use, the last 9 years will show a much better rate of improvement than the previous 7 or 8. That's the key issue. That's why people are agitated.
Okay. But the question is this, that since you have mentioned deprivation, the Rural Development Ministry, also a part of the same UPA, commissions a survey which is headed by Abhijit Sen, who's also a member of your planning commission. And that survey does a socio-economic analysis and it looks at deprivation. And it actually says that 248 million people in rural India are deprived. It says 32% people live in abject poverty. Now obviously it's using a different measurement system, it's doing a socio-economic analysis. But when you have this number coming out from a survey that is commissioned by this government and by a planning commission member, and you juxtapose it with your planning commission report, which then says 216 million people are actually poor, these are contradictory numbers.
They're not contradictory. I'm glad you raised this issue. You know, the reason why the socio-economic census was done was because, say, on the food side, we want to identify those people who are going to be eligible for the food subsidy, okay? We've decided that 75% of rural India should be eligible. Now, what they've done, in order to identify those people, you have to have a census. I mean, a survey will not identify who's poor because it's a sample. So in this socio-economic census, they've identified certain characteristics which guarantee that you will get it, and then there are certain characteristics which exclude whether you're going to get it or not.
Yes.
And these are not income linked and these are not consumption linked. I mean, for example, if you're scheduled caste or scheduled tribe and you don't have a government job, then you're in automatically and you're not measuring what your income is. Similarly, if you've got a kacha roof or something, you don't have a pakka roof, you're counted as in. They're not income or consumption based. And let me say that those measures are bound to vary quite a bit. See, the important question is we don't have an SEC number of what it was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
If you had an SEC number of what it was 10 years ago, you'd be able to make a comparison. The important point about the NSS data is it is the only data that enables you to compare over time. And I must mention to you that while I'm happy to accept the proposition that we should raise our own poverty line, the poverty line that Tendulkar used is very comparable to what is currently used as the international poverty line. Now, my good friend Swaminathan Iyer wrote a piece in one of our newspapers, and he made a very interesting point that when China raised 200 million people above poverty, it was with respect to the same kind of poverty line, and everybody celebrated China's success, and during that period we weren't raising that many people. In 1993-94, the number of people who were poor was about 404 million in India, and in 2004 that had gone to 407. In other words, although the percentage came down, the absolute number had increased, and everybody said this is terrible. What the new data do, they show that today, using that line, which is the same line that the Chinese had, which is the same line that the international community has, there are 130 million people less who are poor. That doesn't mean, by the way, that poverty has been eliminated. I hate to have NDTV have a little box in this show that you're having where you'll show two very poor people. I mean, we still have a lot of very poor people. All we're saying is we have fewer of them.
But here's the point, since you brought up China and since you brought up the international norms. In Europe, or in much of Europe, for example, when you do measure poverty, you also link it in relation to the national average income. In other words, if the rich get richer, you also have a sense of the inequality. The reason that these figures disturb one in India instead of creating a celebration is because the gap between the rich and the poor seems to keep rising. Inflation is rising, growth is not, and growth seems to only benefit at this moment in an anecdotal way the very rich. We're not measuring inequality in these numbers. And one other point, it's very difficult to look at a country where 50% people do not have access to toilets, people defecate in the open, and then look at these figures as anything but extremely esoteric. They don't seem real for a country where sanitation remains something that's not an entitlement.
I agree with you, and that is why in the 12th plan we have said that deprivation is multidimensional. I think, for example, the solution, you mentioned relating poverty to average levels of consumption. I think that's a good measure. I think in Germany, anybody who has less than 1/3 of the average level of consumption is deemed to be poor. You'll be surprised, by the way, that if you use the NSS data, and you chose 1/3 of the average, you would not come up with a very large number because the average is quite low. I think frankly what's happening here is people are looking at poverty and they're saying, I mean, for example, the latest poverty numbers for a family of 5 in urban areas, it means if you have one wage earner, your family consumption expenditure is 5,000 rupees a month. That's very low. What people are doing is, people are looking at it from the perspective of the Aam Aadmi, and they're saying, look, 5,000 is nothing. But you've got to be clear, it was historically meant to be an absolutely rock bottom level. It was not meant to be a comfort level.
But you know, they're also looking at the fact that at the Parliament canteen you can get tea for 1 rupee, which is 6 rupees outside, that you can get a thali for 12 rupees 50 paisa, which is at a minimum 30 rupees outside. So people are agitated, and would you blame them for that?
No, look, as long as there is one person who's desperately poor in this country, anyone who's agitated about poverty is doing a good thing. If the focus is, let's try to do more for the poor. But if you're trying to hide the fact that poverty, the fewer poor people by those standards than there were 10 years ago, if you're blind to the fact that whatever has happened in the last 10 years has pushed a lot more people from the category of poor to the category of above poverty line, that doesn't mean they're rich. Look, I've had emails coming to me saying, you think if I have 1 rupee more than 33 per person per day, I'm rich? You know, the difference between poor, which is very poor, and rich, there's a huge span in between. And I feel that, you know, the government, the debate has also changed. Look, in the 1970s, our concern was, I mean, the slogan was Garibi Hatao, because the percentage of the population that was below the poverty line was very high. Today, the slogan is Aam Aadmi. Aam Aadmi is not poor, but he's not very rich either. So I think the focus of the government is shifted.
But when you say Aam Aadmi is not poor, and you have Abhijit Sen's report for the Rural Development Ministry saying 32% live in abject poverty, how do you reconcile these two statements?
Because let me put it this way.
What do you mean Aam Aadmi is not poor? When you say Aam Aadmi is not poor, what does it mean?
You can take either Abhijit Sen's
I'm just saying there are many contradictory assessments.
Latest number on the Tendulkar side, the Tendulkar numbers show about 22% as poor. Okay, I'm perfectly willing to agree that that line is a bit low. We don't know what Rangarajan is going to produce. He's going to do it a year from now. But I'm 100% sure. I would happily accept an increase in the line that would make whatever 35% poor from 22. But 35% is still the bottom 1/3. The Aam Aadmi then has to be the next 1/3. From 35 to whatever it is, 65, 70. So I think we need to distinguish the following categories. There's the rich, let's forget about them. I don't think the government owes them anything other than security and a decent environment. But we're giving them the right to food. We're giving the rich the right to food. You're not, because only 50% of urban India is getting the right to food. So the rich are not. They won't be getting it. Next to the rich, you might say, you have the upper middle classes. These are people who are quite well off, people who are getting into hoping to buy Maruti cars, comfortable, but their budgets are stressed. I mean, let's be clear, except for the rich, even the prosperous middle classes have a strain on their budget. It's at a different level. Then you have the Aam Aadmi. Basically, you know, they have housing, they have some schooling, but the quality is poor. They're getting water from the municipal sources, but the quality is uncertain. And in rural areas, these facilities don't exist at all. And then you have the poor. Now, I think too much of the focus on poverty is as if everybody who feels that, you know, they have a problem are being told, because you're above the poverty line, you don't have a problem. That is not at all the case. Our whole approach is, the poor is actually the weakest group. They should be our first priority. But we're actually talking about the Aam Aadmi.
Would you like to see the criteria change, as some of the UPA ministers and Congress politicians have suggested? I know Rangarajan's already looking at it. I'm asking you your opinion. Do you believe that the poverty line is too low?
See, in my view, when per capita income rises, the poverty line should rise appropriately. It doesn't mean every year. Like, my guess would be every 10 years we should redefine the poverty line. Historically, the poverty line has been viewed as a kind of an absolute rock bottom minimum. Now, you know, that made some sense when 70% were below the poverty line. You brought it down to 35 or so. Then it goes down to 22, according to the Tendulkar number.
But you know,
I think it makes sense.
But you know, you still have the UNDP, for example, using a multi-dimensional poverty index to say 55% of India is below the poverty line. So that's the problem. That
no, but there's nothing wrong. I mean, we should move to a, but remember, if you move to a multi-dimensional index, you will not be able to measure changes every year. Because, for example, how many people have access to various facilities, this data will become available through different surveys at different points in time. You know, if you were looking, if you want an index that tells you how is growth affecting poverty, you probably need 2 or 3 different indices. I mean, take health, for example.
Yeah.
Health is vital, right? There's no doubt in my mind that we have huge health problems. Sometimes prosperity is bringing health problems, like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity.
Yeah.
But I think if you look at India and you say, well, is the health situation improving? You have to notice the fact that polio is gone. I mean, so I think that I'm in favor of focusing on what are gaps. But please combine that with an honest recognition that progress is being made. That's why I find that the argument, the political argument, when parties in the opposition claim that this line is a fraud on the people, when they were in power they had an even lower line and never bothered to change it, that's ridiculous.
But much of the opposition to these figures is also coming from the UPA. Like I said, I mentioned Rajiv Shukla, Kapil Sibal, Digvijay Singh, all questioning the poverty line. Does that disturb you that what was meant to be a report saying that this is great news?
They've read the plan. I'm happy. The plan says that this is deprivation is a multi-dimensional phenomenon. All I'm trying to say is that one important dimension is consumption poverty, and let's recognize, look, if India was being criticized, that's pre-UPA, if India was being criticized for reducing poverty only at the rate of 0.74 percentage points per year for a large part of the time, being criticized, and the poverty line was then thought good enough to justify making that criticism, then when that same poverty line says it's now declining at 2.2%, we should have the decency to say, well, at least on this dimension, things are better. I'm not saying that poverty is gone. There's a hell of a lot of poor people. But not even to acknowledge that is ridiculous. And let me make another point. Globally, the Millennium Development Goals have a target. Developing countries must halve poverty. The poverty line is that $1.25, which is roughly equal to the Tendulkar line. If you accept that, we have met the Millennium Development Goal. Is that not worth telling the people about? Is it sensible to describe that as a fraud on the people? I think that's just rubbish. Okay. I mean, let's be clear. When there's good news, acknowledge it, but put it in its context. It's not everything, and there's no question in my mind that poverty is much more complex than this poverty line. So that's why we appointed the Rangarajan committee, after all, was appointed by the Planning Commission in recognition of the fact that it's complicated. But because he's not able to submit a report right now, should we not document that this is what the survey says? Let
me ask you in the end, that do you believe that this debate in a sense mirrors what has now come to be known as the Amartya Sen versus Jagdish Bhagwati debate? That in some ways it's all about how India looks at itself. How, if you look at Sen and Drez's latest book, and it speaks about the uncertain glory of India, and it takes us back to how India actually underperformed on some key social sector indices, comparing it with Bangladesh, which Amartya Sen argues has done much better. So do you see this as a Sen versus Bhagwati kind of fault line?
I know and like both Sen and Bhagwati, and
which side are you on in the debate?
I like to think that the newspaper, I must confess, I enjoy reading these pieces that pit people against each other. It happens to us all the time. But frankly, I think neither of them has said that growth is not important, and neither of them has said that the social side is not important. I think Sen is more associated with, as it were, drawing our attention to the fact that, look, while the growth is good, you're not doing as well on the social side. I think that's true. Now, Bhagwati is also right in saying we needed the growth, otherwise how do we pay for the social side? Yeah. But to the extent to which Sen is associated with focusing on this, I mean, he says, look, growth, of course growth is important, there are enough people pushing for growth, hopefully. I think he's pointing to an area which is much more complex. And when I say complex, it's like, it's not enough to say, which we are saying, that we must spend more money on education, we must spend more money on health. The real thing is to deliver good health and good education.
Which would you choose as your model, the Sen model or the Bhagwati model?
I'm not aware that either of them can. I choose the Planning Commission model. I mean, look, we have consistently said, in order to set this debate at rest, in the 12th plan, we said there should be 25 monitorable indicators of progress.
Yeah.
And they include GDP growth, they include the composition of growth, that we need better agriculture and we need manufacturing. Ignoring manufacturing means no employment. And we need gender equality, and we need reduced maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates, 25 indicators, which includes some from the sustainability side. So frankly, it's impossible to get all these indicators every year. But I would like to think that if we were looking at India at the end of, say, the 12th plan or this year, we'll know 5 years later what all these data say.
Okay.
And I think we would then, if on those 25 indicators, we're making progress on each, I think we're doing a very good job. And I think we will be making progress on each.
Well, we'll leave it there. The poverty debate is now a politicized debate, and that tends to create sometimes more noise than light. Thank you so much, Montek Ahluwalia, for talking to us.
Thanks.
Thank you.